In some version of the Star Wars galaxy, a Kaleesh warlord stands on the beaches of Kalee, where the person he named himself after was killed. Her name was Ronderu Kummar. She was a swordswoman and his closest comrade, and the Hook took her, and the Jenuwaa Sea took her body, and there was nothing left to bury. He took 10 wives in the years that followed. He fathered 30 children. The weight of those numbers, 10 wives, 30 children, doesn't read like a man rebuilding his life. It reads like a man repeating an attempt that kept failing. Eventually, he stopped trying to fill the absence and instead named himself after it. He took the name Grievous, because grief was the only thing he had that still made sense. Grievous's original backstory was simply devastating, a perfect foreshadowing of Anakin's dark destiny with the Sith, and the Clone Wars show completely erased it. That claim has 3 moving parts. Devastating identifies the register. This isn't a backstory that explains a villain. It's one that breaks you a little, because you can see the person underneath the chrome. Foreshadowing identifies the function. This wasn't atmosphere. It was load-bearing architecture, connecting the Separatist commanders to Anakin's fall in ways that made the prequel trilogy's tragedy legible before it arrived. And erased identifies what happened to it. Not, the EU was bigger and richer. Not, old fans are nostalgic. Specifically, this backstory was doing real narrative work, and it's gone. This is the case for what was lost. It covers Grievous in full, from Kalee to Chrome. It covers Durge, whose story the Legends material left unfinished in a specific way that changes how you understand why he joined the Confederacy, and how he died. It covers a Chiss Supreme Commander, who held the top position in the Separatist military before Grievous ever took the role, who TCW never acknowledged by name, despite covering the exact war she commanded. And it covers a planet called Jabim, whose Clone Wars wound didn't close when the war ended. It traveled 20 years and found Luke Skywalker. Before any of that, the most important distinction in this entire argument, because it determines what can be proven and what can only be mourned. Omission and erasure are different problems. Most of what this video covers is omission. Durge doesn't appear in the Clone Wars. That's not a retcon. It's the show declining to tell that story. Severance Tan was never referenced across more than 100 episodes of a series about the war she helped start. Omission. Jabiim's cross-era arc, a Clone Wars battle whose consequences followed a Skywalker into the original trilogy, wasn't part of a show focused on the prequel era. Format constraint, not retcon. Grievous is different, specifically different, in a way the sources document directly. In Legends, the Wikipedia event article on the sabotage of Grievous's shuttle is unambiguous. Count Dooku arranged the crash, which resulted in the destruction of most of Grievous's organic body, necessitating complete cybernetic reconstruction. The novel Labyrinth of Evil is among the sources establishing this sequence. The transformation was engineered. A Sith Lord found a being shaped by documented, legitimate grievances, manufactured a crisis to destroy his body, and then redirected the survivor's existing rage at the institutions responsible for those grievances. That is a deliberate construction, a specific choice made by a specific actor with a specific agenda. Canon removes the Dooku orchestration. The crash becomes an accident without an architect behind it. What fills the motivational space in TCW-era material is a Grievous whose transformation is self-directed, reportedly drawn by admiration for Jedi capabilities and a desire to match or exceed them, reportedly choosing extensive cybernetic augmentation rather than being maneuvered into it. The Lair of Grievous arc in TCW Season 1 changed specific backstory elements from the Legends version. The result is a cyborg who wanted to be this, rather than a weapon the Sith made from someone else's grief. That's not omission. That's assignment of a new motivation in place of an established one. The case for that distinction is the hinge of this entire argument. To understand why it matters beyond lore preference, you need to understand what the original story was actually built to do, which means you need to know the full story. His full name was Kaiman Jai Shilal. Born on Kalee, a planet the source material describes as perpetually torn by famine and war, He grew up in conditions that the planet itself seemed designed to produce as a selection pressure. Either forge something durable or break. The Kaleesh are a reptilian species, and Kalee is the kind of world that makes its people hard out of necessity rather than preference. Shilal became the most powerful warlord Kalee had ever known, not because the position was available and he filled it by default, but because the planet kept requiring someone capable of holding it, and he kept being that someone. The Yamri arrived with superior technology and an explicit program. The Kaleesh called them the Hook, which carried contempt and accuracy in roughly equal measure. These weren't raiders making territorial claims or resource grabs at the margins. The Hook came to Kalee to own its people, to enslave a species, and they arrived with the kind of technological advantage that turns what should be a military conflict into a logistics problem for the invader. The Kaleesh had Shilal. They had the specific urgency of a people who understood what defeat meant, not in abstract strategic terms, but in terms of chains and labor, and the systematic erasure of everything that made them themselves. They fought with that understanding as their operational advantage. The Hook, for all their technological superiority, weren't fighting people who could afford to lose. The Kaleesh, under Shilal, were winning. The Hook solved the problem through political channels rather than military ones. The Republic and the Hook had existing relationships, the kind of diplomatic and commercial connections built over decades of galactic integration. Those connections were sufficient to route a complaint through the correct Republic corridors and receive a substantive response. The Republic, acting on an allied party's petition regarding a conflict it hadn't been monitoring closely, dispatched an intervention. Masters Tchuka Du'un and Jamar arrived at Kalee with 50 Jedi Knights and Jedi Masters behind them. 50. That number matters because it doesn't describe a diplomatic mission or a monitoring force. It describes an intervention assembled at scale, moral authority and combat capability deployed together, arriving with the institutional weight of the Republic's peacekeepers behind every decision they made. They arrived on the side of the Hook, not because they had examined the Kaleesh case and found it wanting, because the Hook had political access and the Kaleesh didn't, and the galaxy's most trusted peacekeeping institution made a judgment about a conflict it understood incompletely. The Republic followed with economic instruments, heavy fines and embargoes on the Kaleesh. These didn't operate like military force. They operated like strangulation, methodical and patient, applied at the planetary economy's pressure points across months rather than weeks. Kalee fell into poverty. Hundreds of thousands of Kaleesh starved and died. In the aftermath, the Hook desecrated sacred Kaleesh burial grounds, the specific category of violation that goes beyond military defeat into cultural erasure, targeting a people's relationship with their own dead, their own history, their own continuity as a civilization. The Republic, the institution that had intervened to end the war, took no action. Stand inside this from Shilal's position. An insectoid species invades your world with the stated purpose of enslaving your people. You build a military resistance from the resources of a planet that never had surplus. You fight with everything Kalee can produce, and you're winning. Then the peacekeepers arrive, the Jedi, the moral center of the galactic order, the institution that exists to protect precisely this kind of situation, and they take the invader's side. Not because they found you guilty of anything specific, because your enemy had better lobbyists. The economic consequences that follow accomplish what the Hook's military couldn't. Your burial grounds get violated, while the institution that rendered its judgment looks away. Hundreds of thousands of your people starve. The Jedi who landed on Kalee weren't acting in bad faith. Political interventions rarely come with full consequence maps. Tchuka Du'un and Jamar were responding to information they had, making a call under institutional pressure, operating within a Republic system that had structural access problems for worlds like Kalee. They weren't villains. They were peacekeepers who made a wrong call in a galaxy that required constant calls. And this one killed hundreds of thousands of people. And none of the people who made it bore any of the cost. The scale of the miscalculation is what makes it useful to the Sith later. Shilal's hatred of the Republic and the Jedi wasn't manufactured from whole cloth. It was built on a foundation of documented, measurable, historically confirmed wrong. That's the material Dooku would eventually find. Throughout all of it, Shilal had one constant: Ronderu liege Kummar, a swordswoman, described in the Legends material as skilled enough to earn the specific respect that warriors in constant conflict reserve for people who have genuinely earned it, not simply survived long enough to accumulate it. The official Wikipedia language describes her as his closest comrade. What the psychological evidence of his subsequent behavior suggests is something the word doesn't fully contain. When the Hook killed her on the beaches of Kalee during the war, and her body was taken by the Jenuwaa Sea, and there was nothing to recover and nothing to bury, Shilal experienced what the source material explicitly characterizes as despair and a horrible psychotic depression. 10 wives, 30 children. The source material records this not as a narrative of recovery, but as an accumulation of attempts, each one failing to displace what the Jenuwaa Sea had taken. The arithmetic is devastating in its precision. He tried, by different methods, across what must have been years, and the absence didn't shift. It didn't become smaller. It didn't integrate into the ordinary texture of grief that time is supposed to produce. It stayed at the same size, occupying the same space, and nothing he added to his life occupied that space instead. He stopped trying. He named himself after the absence instead. He took the name Grievous in her memory. That detail needs to sit in its full context. The name General Grievous, the name that would eventually appear on Republic military briefings, on HoloNet news broadcasts, spoken in Senate chambers with voices slightly lower than usual, wasn't chosen for intimidation. It wasn't a warrior's epithet designed to communicate something about how he fought. It was a mourning name. It was the word for what had been done to him, given to himself as an identity, because the grief was the only remaining thing that was fully accurate. He stopped performing recovery and became something else instead, a being defined by a specific loss, no longer pretending that wasn't the organizing principle of his existence. The Sith found him in that condition. The Sith, as the Sith always do, were looking for exactly that kind of raw material. Count Dooku's operation was calibrated to the wound with the precision of someone who had been watching the situation develop and understood exactly what he was looking at. A warlord with demonstrated military capability, the loyalty of his people, documented, legitimate, burning grievances against the Republic and the Jedi both, and broken by personal loss in a way that gave the political grievances a psychological foundation they wouldn't otherwise have, an emotional infrastructure that made them not just remembered, but felt daily, at the level of identity rather than politics. Dooku wasn't creating enmity. He was finding enmity that already existed and providing it with an author. He arranged the sabotage of Grievous's shuttle. The Wikipedia article on the event documents this directly. Count Dooku arranged the crash, which resulted in the destruction of most of Grievous's body and nearly killed him, necessitating complete cybernetic reconstruction. Labyrinth of Evil is among the novels establishing this sequence. The crash left Grievous with barely enough living matter to sustain biological function. A nervous system, some organic remnants, whatever the wreckage hadn't consumed. He didn't survive the crash in any meaningful sense of the word. What survived was structural, a system that could be rebuilt around, organic remnants that couldn't be fully replaced, the foundation of what the intergalactic banking clan would reconstruct into something useful for the war the Sith were building. The IBC handled the reconstruction. A CIS sub-faction with the resources to undertake comprehensive rebuild work and the motive to produce a capable weapon for the coming conflict. They built him as what the source material describes as more machine than Kaleesh, the organic tissue that remained, giving him a persistent cough that accompanied every subsequent appearance, every engagement, every moment he moved through a corridor or descended on a starship in a boarding action. That cough carries into Revenge of the Sith, where it functions as a mild character detail, making the villain feel slightly diminished between confrontations. In Legends, it carries different weight entirely. It's the sound of incomplete transformation, the organic matter that the manufacturing process couldn't replace, the biological remnant of the person who existed before the crash, persisting in a frame rebuilt for someone else's purpose, objecting in the only way left to it. The cough is what the IBC couldn't build over. The proof, audible and present in every scene, that something organic was used in the construction of this weapon, and still occasionally protests the terms. After the reconstruction, Dooku trained Grievous in lightsaber combat. The man who engineered the crash that necessitated the rebuild then became the instructor who defined what the rebuilt being could do with its new body. Dooku destroyed Grievous, and then shaped what the destruction produced. That's a production line with a finishing stage, not mentorship. What made the deception effective was its precision. When Dooku told Grievous who had caused the crash, pointing at the Republic, pointing at the Jedi, he wasn't constructing a complete fiction. The Republic had imposed the embargoes. The Jedi had intervened on the Hook's side. Tutuka Duun and Jamar had arrived with 50 Jedi and made the wrong call. Hundreds of thousands of Kaleesh had died as a consequence of that wrong call. The institutions Dooku was pointing at had genuinely done measurable, documented damage to Kalee. He wasn't asking Grievous to believe something fabricated. He was asking Grievous to assign authorship of the worst thing that had ever happened to him, the shuttle crash, the destruction of his body, to institutions whose actual record already supported the indictment for everything else. That's a more effective operation than a lie would have been. A lie requires the target to accept something their experience can't corroborate. Dooku required only that Grievous accept one additional attribution, the crash, and attach it to a set of institutions whose existing culpability for everything else was real. The enmity was already there, already burning, already had a foundation in actual events. Dooku gave it a target and a direction and a war to fight. Now lay the Anakin parallel over this, because in Legends, this parallel is architectural, built into the structure of what these characters were, visible in every load-bearing element of both stories. Anakin Skywalker is a warrior with a consuming, documented attachment to someone he can't afford to lose. He is manipulated by a Sith Lord, the same generation of Sith, using the same political methodology, into choices that destroy his organic body. He is rebuilt as machinery around remaining living tissue, his breathing maintained by a respirator that performs the same function Grievous's cough performs, the sound of organic material that survived what was done to it, persisting in a frame rebuilt for a Sith's purpose. Palpatine shaped Vader by exploiting attachment to someone Anakin loved. Dooku shaped Grievous by exploiting loss of someone Grievous had named himself after. Both used grief as the operational lever. Both produced weapons. The distinction between the two cases, in Legends, is structurally precise and appears deliberate. Grievous's transformation is physical first, a body destroyed by external agency, rebuilt as machinery, the organic self progressively supplanted. What remains of Kaimain Jai Shilal inside the chrome frame is diminishing, coughing, persisting without agency over what it's attached to. Anakin's transformation is spiritual first, physical second. The soul hollowed out by choices made in fear and desperation. The moral self dismantled by Palpatine's sustained manipulation, before the body follows at the end of Revenge of the Sith. Climbing into the suit, the breathing starting, the transformation completing its outward form. One goes outside in, one goes inside out. The Sith methodology doesn't have a preferred direction. It finds whatever surface is available and works inward from there. Together, they form a complete argument about what the dark side produces. This is the destination, regardless of the route. Different raw material, different entry point, same outcome. Grievous demonstrates it first, in chrome and a cough and a hatred manufactured from legitimate grief, then redirected by a Sith Lord at a political war. Anakin confirms it 20 years later, in a black suit and a respirator, having done to his own soul what Dooku had someone else do to Grievous's body. Grievous walks through the prequel narrative, wearing the future on his frame. He is what Anakin is becoming, rendered in advance and put on display, not concealed in subtext, not symbolic in a way requiring interpretation, but structurally visible to anyone watching what the Sith process actually produces. The mourning name, the organic remnants that didn't integrate, the institutional hatred built from real grievances and redirected by a Sith Lord toward a political war the Sith engineered. Every element appears again in Anakin, the attachment Palpatine exploits, the Jedi Council frustrations that give the manipulation genuine purchase, the body rebuilt in service of the Sith's agenda. In Legends, the prequel tragedy isn't personal to Anakin, it's a methodology. The galaxy is already full of demonstrations of it. Grievous demonstrates it first. Anakin confirms it. The franchise was showing you the answer before it asked you the question. The name on Grievous's frame was a mourning name, chosen for absence. The name in Vader's suit is a burial name. Anakin Skywalker, dead in function if not in biology, replaced by something that serves the same master who manufactured the conditions of his death. Same process, different stage of completion. What TCW replaced this with is documentable. TCW's Grievous is characterized, across most of the series, as a figure who struggles to win fair fights and is routinely prepared to withdraw. The exceptions are specific and worth naming. The Grievous intrigue arc, heroes on both sides, massacre, and portions of Lair of Grievous, because they demonstrate that TCW was capable of writing a threatening Grievous when it chose to. But across more than 100 episodes, the baseline is a recurring obstacle rather than a structural argument. A menace who exists to be escaped from, rather than understood. The Lair of Grievous arc in Season 1 changed specific backstory elements from the Legends version. What TCW-era framing installs in the space the Dooku orchestration vacated is a Grievous whose transformation is self-directed, a being who reportedly chose extensive cybernetic augmentation, drawn by admiration for Jedi capabilities and a desire to match or surpass them. The crash becomes an accident. The reconstruction becomes a personal project. The warlord who was manufactured into a weapon becomes a being who walked into the manufacturing process voluntarily. Strip out the Dooku orchestration, and you lose the parallel entirely. A Grievous who chose this isn't showing you what the Sith do to people. He's showing you what unchecked ambition does. Those are different arguments, and only one of them foreshadows Anakin Skywalker. Anakin's tragedy is specifically that he didn't choose it in the way individual ambition implies choice. He was maneuvered, exploited, operated on by a Sith Lord who spent years locating the exact vulnerability. His love, his terror of loss, his genuine care for someone he couldn't afford to lose, and used it as a lever. The manipulation is the point. The Sith's capacity to redirect genuine human feeling, legitimate grief, real institutional frustration, into catastrophic outcomes. That's what makes the fall tragic rather than simply unfortunate. Legends Grievous demonstrates that capacity in advance. Canon Grievous demonstrates that some beings choose extensive cybernetics. Not a warning, an obstacle. The distinction is the loss. Durge is pure omission. TCW never engaged with him at all. But what was omitted is the specific piece that completes the picture. And that piece connects directly to the architecture being built here. He was Gendai, approximately 3 meters tall, composed of regenerative biological tissue, capable of absorbing essentially any wound. The Gendai body rebuilds itself. Limbs severed, organs destroyed, structural damage of most descriptions. The biology repairs it. The dense mass of tentacle-like nervous tissue regenerating around almost any trauma. The only reliable method of killing a Gendai is destroying the primary nerve cluster concentrated in the head or neck. Everything else grows back. Everything. Durge was approximately 2,000 years old when the Clone Wars started. The Gendai species' lifespan runs from 4,000 years to over 7,000. At 2,000 years old, Durge had not reached the midpoint of his species' most conservative possible lifespan. By the upper estimate, he had cleared less than a third of what his biology was built to support. By his own species' developmental standards, by the proportional logic of a life that could run to 7 millennia, Durge wasn't middle-aged. He was young, something closer, in proportional terms, to what a human would describe as late adolescence or early adulthood. When Anakin Skywalker launched him into a nearby star during the Clone Wars, Durge hadn't lived through even the first third of what his species' biology was built to support. That's the punchline. That's also the thematic bridge. Not an equivalence. Durge was 2,000 years old, active, choosing to be present on a battlefield, functionally attempting to kill clone troopers in industrial volume. The moral weight isn't the same, but the category of observation the audience instinctively made is the same. Anakin destroying something the galaxy wasn't finished with, as part of a transformation into a being that killed without calculating what it was taking. Durge's hatred of Mandalorians had been running for most of those 2,000 years. Its origin was a being named Jang, an ex-Mandalorian who served as Durge's mentor and friend, the figure who shaped him across what must have been, given the timescales, decades of proximity. The specific circumstances of Jang's end aren't fully preserved in the surviving material, but the consequence is documented across multiple sources spanning centuries of Durge's subsequent behavior. Whatever happened to Jang, it seeded something in Durge that didn't diminish with time. It grew. 2 millennia is long enough to develop a wound into something architectural. Not a grief Durge was still experiencing as a fresh injury, but a structural feature of how he processed every Mandalorian he encountered. Over those 2,000 years, he killed at least one Mandalore, the supreme leader of the Mandalorian people, working through the accounting. The accounting never balanced. The mathematics of revenge across that kind of timescale doesn't produce equilibrium. It produces compounding interest on a debt whose original creditor is no longer alive to receive payment. When the Confederacy of Independent Systems came to recruit him, they didn't bring a political argument about republic overreach, or corporate taxation, or planetary sovereignty. They brought a biological one. Jango Fett, a Mandalorian, or at minimum, a being who claimed Mandalorian identity and heritage, had provided the genetic template for the Grand Army of the Republic. Every clone trooper fielded in every engagement of the Clone Wars was, genetically, Jango Fett. Hundreds of thousands of Mandalorian faces in Republic armor, deployed across the galaxy wherever the war reached. Multiple sources confirm what Durge understood when he heard the offer. The CIS was giving him the opportunity to kill clone troopers who carried Mandalorian genetics. Not ideology. Not political conviction in the cause of separatism. Not any of the legitimate grievances that other member worlds brought to the Confederacy. Worlds with real and documented reasons to distrust the Republic's Senate and its corporate entanglements. For Durge, the argument was targeted and genetic. His mentor's fate had created 2,000 years of compounding obsession, and the Republic was now fielding an army built from a Mandalorian's template. Join us. The CIS found a being with 2 millennia of documented, species-specific violence and pointed him at the enemy. This methodology is consistent with Grievous's recruitment. In both cases, the Separatist leadership located a being already shaped by prior violence, identified the wound, and provided a direction. The Confederacy of Independent Systems, in Legends, wasn't only a political coalition of worlds with legitimate grievances against the Republic's governance. At its operational level, it was also an organization that found people the galaxy had already broken and hired their damage. Severance Tan is the commander TCW never acknowledged. Not retconned, not reduced, not referenced a single time across more than 100 episodes of a series dedicated to covering the exact war she commanded. She has a Wikipedia Legends entry. She was the primary antagonist of a 2001 strategy game. She held the Supreme Commander position in the Separatist military at the moment the Clone Wars began, and TCW, which covered Dooku and Ventress and Grievous and the entire Separatist Council through multiple arcs, never used her name. Her Wikipedia Legends entry documents what she was precisely. Severance Tan was a Force-sensitive Chiss female who left Chiss space to become a dark acolyte and general as Supreme Commander of the Confederacy military. Supreme Commander, the top position. The command structure Grievous eventually inherited, Tan built and held first. Grievous didn't construct the Separatist military. He took over from someone who already had. She was Chiss, the same species as Grand Admiral Thrawn, operating in Galactic Military Command decades before Thrawn became a major franchise presence. A Force-sensitive Chiss in the prequel era, trained under Count Dooku, commanding the Confederate military in the war's opening months. That's a character strand connecting two of the franchise's most distinctive figures across timelines that TCW's substantial coverage of both the prequel era and, through Rebels, the Imperial era, never attempted to draw together. Whether that's a creative choice or simply a gap left by format constraints is debatable. The strand exists in Legends. The show didn't pull it. Her relationship to Dooku was that of a dark acolyte, not formally Sith. The rule of two left no room for that, but trained by Dooku and deployed as his agent at the highest level of his military command. This is the structural role Asajj Ventress occupies in TCW, with one significant difference. Tan predated the show's creation by 7 years and arrived with a distinct prior history, a distinct species identity, and a distinct narrative function. Ventress was built for TCW. Tan was built for a 2001 RTS game and left there. Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds covers the opening months of the Clone Wars, the densest period TCW itself covers. Tan led Confederate forces through a series of campaigns during those months, operating as the Separatist military's command authority at the precise moment the Republic was scrambling to deploy its newly activated clone army. The opening engagements of the war, the resource seizures, the strategic positioning, the early operations that established the terms of the conflict, were being run by her. She was there for the start. She died during those campaigns. Echu Shenjan, a Jedi Master, killed her. The death isn't incidental to the narrative the game builds around it. Shenjan's arc through Galactic Battlegrounds is defined by what he was willing to become to stop her. The campaign pushed him toward the dark side, the game's structural argument being that fighting Tan required accessing the same capacity for violence and obsession that the Jedi existed to restrain. He crossed the line. He killed her. That act, a Jedi Master doing what his training told him he couldn't do because his opponent required it, is the game's central moral question. Tan didn't die because she was manageable. She died because she was dangerous enough to change the person who stopped her. There's more narrative architecture in that single character death than TCW gave most of its recurring secondary antagonists across full season arcs. Galactic Battlegrounds came out in 2001. The Clone Wars series launched in 2008. Across 7+ years and more than 100 episodes of the most sustained engagement with the Clone Wars era the franchise had ever produced, TCW built its Separatist leadership around Dooku, Ventress, Grievous, and the largely interchangeable council members who were executed on Mustafar. The gap at the top of the org chart, the Supreme Commander who held the position before Grievous, the Chiss Dark Acolyte whose campaigns shaped the war's opening phase, went unfilled. No explanation survives in available production records. The most structurally honest reason is probably that she wasn't visible enough to demand inclusion. TCW built around what audiences were asking for. Nobody was asking about a 2001 strategy game's primary antagonist, so she was left there. She has no meaningful place in the canon continuity TCW established. She is a well-constructed character with genuine narrative weight. A Chiss Supreme Commander who preceded Grievous, shaped by Dooku, killed by a Jedi who was morally altered by the act of killing her. And the show that spent 7 seasons on the war she helped start never mentioned her. Jabim is the architectural argument. Not for character depth, though it has that. Not for tragic backstory, though it has that too. For the structural difference between what Legends was doing with the Clone Wars era and what TCW was doing with it. Jabiim demonstrates that Legends was building consequences designed to travel through time, surviving decades, crossing the gap between the prequel era and the original trilogy, arriving intact and operational in a different trilogy, on a different character, attached to a different Skywalker. The war reached Jabim during the Clone Wars. Republic forces were deployed there, including Anakin Skywalker. The people of Jabim who sided with the Republic committed themselves to that alignment, invested in the Republic's presence as a promise, not just a tactical arrangement. Dark Horse's Republic-era comics document the battle and what followed. The Republic withdrew. The calculation was real. A galaxy-wide conflict can't honor every position it holds without becoming a purely defensive operation rather than a war. The strategic logic was sound. The mathematics of fighting on hundreds of fronts simultaneously produces situations where abandonment is the only available answer. None of that changed what it meant for the people of Jabim left behind. They remembered. Specifically, permanently, and operationally. Not as a historical grievance that softened with generational change. Not as a wound that became contextual over time. Something the survivors processed into a complicated relationship with the Republic rather than a simple one. They held it the way Durge held the memory of Jang, as a structural feature rather than an ongoing experience. For 20 years, across the fall of the Republic, the rise of the Empire, the entire political transformation of the galaxy, Jabim's surviving population retained a specific accounting. The war had arrived carrying a name. The withdrawal had confirmed what that name was worth. When Luke Skywalker reached Jabim in the original trilogy era, the population attempted to kill him because of his father's name. Not symbolically. Not as a thematic statement about inherited legacy that the narrative gestures toward from a respectful distance. Literally, the people of Jabim tried to kill Luke Skywalker because Anakin Skywalker's war had arrived on their planet, made a commitment, and then departed. The Dark Horse comics covering this arc document exactly how the wound crossed the 20-year gap and found the right Skywalker to attach itself to. Luke Skywalker hadn't been born during the Clone Wars. He had no agency in what his father had done or failed to do on Jabim. He arrived carrying a name he'd inherited without knowing what that name had cost, on a planet that had been waiting for 2 decades for someone carrying it to appear within range. The accounting didn't care about Luke's individual culpability. It cared about the name. This is what Legends was building when it extended Clone Wars consequences into the original trilogy era. Not as resonance, as a literal causal chain. An action taken by Anakin Skywalker in the prequel era, carrying through the bodies and memories of the people it affected across 20 years, arriving intact to threaten his son in a different war. The wound was precise enough and sustained enough to survive everything that happened between the Republic's abandonment and the son's arrival. The fall of the Republic, the rise of the Empire, the years between. And it was still operational when Luke showed up. The original video's Jabim coverage stopped at the Clone Wars. One of the most sharply felt responses to that coverage was from someone who wrote that Jabim still lives in their head, rent-free. What lives there is the part that stopped. Not the battle, not the withdrawal, but the ending. Luke Skywalker on a planet that is dangerous to him, specifically because of who his father was. That's not the Clone Wars era's story. That's what the Clone Wars era produced, 20 years later, finding the next generation. TCW's format didn't allow for that extension. A prequel-era show covering events between episodes 2 and 3 has no structural access to original trilogy consequences. That's a real constraint, not an accusation. But the constraint means TCW's version of every Clone Wars story is structurally incomplete. The cause without the consequence, the wound without the accounting. Jabim proves that Legends was doing something TCW's episodic format couldn't attempt, building architecture that required both halves to function, consequences that only make full sense once you can see where they land. The broader Legends Separatist picture is built on a specific insight that the prequel trilogy was also building toward from a different angle. The dark side doesn't create evil from nothing. It finds people the galaxy has already shaped, through loss, through legitimate grievance, through documented injury and specific betrayal. and it provides direction. Grievous, manufactured from a warlord's mourning and a Jedi institution's genuine mistake, the result of a Sith Lord locating existing enmity and giving it an author. Durge, aimed at a war using a hatred that had been running for 2 millennia before the war, gave it a target at industrial scale. Severance Tan, a Chiss woman who left her people to serve a Sith's political project, holding the command structure of the Separatist military at the moment it activated, fighting a war whose opening phase was shaped by her decisions before any of TCW's frame characters entered the picture. Jabim's people, holding a name for 20 years until the right person appeared carrying it. Each of them is a different demonstration of the same argument the prequel trilogy was making in Anakin Skywalker. The Sith find the wound. They locate what's already there: the grief, the institutional betrayal, the legitimate rage, the love that turns into terror when it discovers its own vulnerability, and they redirect it. The result looks like villainy from a sufficient distance. From the inside, it's grief with a direction. Anakin Skywalker is the franchise's central demonstration of this. But Legends built a galaxy full of smaller demonstrations, walking around as evidence of what's coming, before it arrives at its most famous subject. Grievous demonstrates the process in advance. Durge demonstrates its durability. The same basic mechanism, running for 2,000 years, still generating violence on command. Severance Tan demonstrates its institutional reach, across species, across borders, into the Chiss, into the supreme command of the Separatist military. Jabim demonstrates its persistence, consequences traveling forward through time until they locate the next available Skywalker. Strip these stories out, and the prequel-era's central tragedy stands alone. Anakin falls, and the galaxy goes dark. And that is genuinely moving. The Clone Wars told parts of it with real craft. The Umbara arc's moral horror, Ahsoka's institutional disillusionment, Order 66 reconstructed across 7 seasons of character investment. TCW produced extraordinary work, and the best of it belongs in any serious conversation about what Star Wars, at its most ambitious, looks like. But in Legends, Anakin's fall wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the most visible confirmation of a methodology the galaxy was already demonstrating on a smaller scale, in chrome and coughing and millennium-old hatred, and a Chiss commander whose campaigns shaped the war that Anakin fought. Grievous was walking through the prequel era, wearing the answer to a question the narrative hadn't asked yet. What does the Sith process look like when you can see it from the outside, before it finishes? A mourning name, a cough no reconstructive surgery could eliminate, a hatred manufactured from something real and redirected into someone else's war. The answer, legible and devastating for anyone watching closely enough to recognize it. Now you know what to look for in Anakin. Now the manipulation is visible before it completes. Now the tragedy isn't just personal, it's a pattern. The Legends universe built a galaxy where the villains were warnings, where every Separatist commander carried the weight of a choice made in darkness that echoed the choice being made at the center of the saga. That architecture is gone. Legends built a tragedy. TCW built a show. Both can be good. Only one of them was devastating. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one.